Okay, my name is Rich. I run a jazz blog called Deep Groove Mono, and this is Record Collector Confessions. I wrote a jazz blog post this week that is part of my Origins of Bop series. In it, I was talking about a popular song called My Ideal. I was listening to various versions of it that have been recorded over the years. I came across this version done by Earl Coleman and Sonny Rollins. I just did not like this version. I've definitely felt, with my particular background with music and jazz specifically, I've definitely asked myself, to what extent do I really have a right to criticize jazz, to criticize jazz artists, jazz musicians? Honestly, I feel pretty conflicted on that. There's always been something about jazz that has rendered it kind of exclusive in a way. My life experience with jazz has been that you can't really just start listening to jazz and get it. The sentiment with rock music, for example, is different, where it's pretty obvious what's going on. You don't need to have made rock music to really feel like you get it and understand it. Way back when I first started listening to jazz, when I had a tape of Kind of Blue and My Favorite Things that I would listen to in my car from time to time. I would say Kind of Blue, I definitely got the emotional message of it, but there were definitely things going on in My Favorite Things where I would get lost and I would just be like, what are these people thinking while they're making this music? And there was just definitely a feeling of confusion and I don't really understand what's going on. And that being something that got in the way of me feeling like I could appreciate it. And eventually, I was playing in a cover band at the time as a DJ. And that cover band, the tenor saxophonist was also a jazz musician. He kind of enlightened me, and my other friend who was a jazz drummer kind of enlightened me on the secrets of jazz also. And that was a big deal. Then it started to make a little more sense to me. When I started getting into jazz and, collecting a lot of albums and listening a lot more. This was around 2012, 2013 probably. I still felt like I had a ways to go. And at some point, someone had given me the advice to basically just keep listening. And that's going to be your path to feeling like you have a better understanding of jazz. So I did. Here I am today, 2021, and I've listened to a lot of jazz. And a lot of times I really feel like I understand what the musicians are trying to do musically, not just even from an emotional standpoint, what they're trying to communicate. That being said, I'm still hesitant to criticize jazz artists. Part of it comes from just feeling like I'm an outsider. It seems like people who are real jazz fans that have a right to speak up about it and actually be critical of it, those people always seem to me like they were just completely immersed in jazz culture. And a lot of times those people were musicians maybe. A lot of other music critics outside of a genre like jazz, like maybe someone who writes for Pitchfork or something, and they cover jazz albums occasionally, but someone like that just seems to have this widespread taste in music, and any sort of quote unquote popular form of music, it seems like they would have a fair say in what's good and what isn't good. I always had that idea in my head that jazz was different, and people who can say that they don't like this album, or I really just felt like I wasn't in that league. So there's a documentary about Jimmy Smith. There's a very memorable part in that documentary where Jimmy Smith he's arguing with a critic about jazz criticism. Jimmy Smith clearly feels that certain people don't have a right to criticize jazz musicians. One could interpret what he's saying as only other musicians, other jazz musicians, should really rightfully criticize jazz or the musicians or their music. I don't disagree with the idea that jazz musicians are the most qualified people to criticize other jazz musicians. He was trying to say something about how the layman knows what he likes, what he can pat his foot to, what he feels from the music, but does he really understand what the musician is feeling and trying to convey? And then he also makes a comment about the phrasing that someone like Dizzy Gillespie can do on his horn, and how a critic, the average jazz critic, doesn't really have a right to say that Dizzy Gillespie does not know his horn. Obviously, that whole scene in that documentary made an impression on me. It made me feel a little self-conscious about criticizing jazz artists. You can talk about things with objective language or subjective language. And it's my feeling that music critics and art critics in general feel pressure to talk about art objectively, as if they believe that there is an objective idea of what is good art, and they have some sort of talent for discerning that. I think we're all guilty of it from time to time. I personally try to talk about stuff I like and don't like, and I try my best to use subjective language. I try to say, like, I don't like this, instead of saying, like, it's terrible. I'm not a trained musician on any instrument. I've done like 2/3 of a minor degree in music in college. So I've taken some music theory, I've taken some piano lessons, I've played the drums, I've studied the drums a little bit. Through all that, I really don't think I have a very good understanding of music theory. I really enjoy learning about music theory. I've gotten to a point where I know a little bit, and I think that what I do know really helps me to better appreciate the music. The deeper I get into the theory, the more I can really follow along and really understand what the artist is trying to do musically. And that's the thing that's different about what Jimmy Smith was saying. I really believe that it's not hard to understand what a jazz musician is trying to convey emotionally. I don't really think that takes a certain special education. But understanding what they're trying to do musically, I think that does. Really, as much as I love jazz, I always feel like there's more that I could do to better appreciate it and better understand it. So I'm always trying to seek out the opinions of actual jazz musicians. And I encourage other collectors to do the same. I'm going to continue with my jazz criticism in a way where I think I'm going to be open about what I like and don't like, but I definitely don't feel like I am in any position to be like, this is bad, this is terrible. What were these musicians thinking? That kind of thing. So I guess that's it for this week. I'll be back next week with another topic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.